That was a good king. Yeah. So this is going to shock you, but this is not an historically accurate outfit. I know. How could that be? Well, a few things. Now, I know you're thinking Vikings did wear recycled high school shoulder pads, and they did all the time, but not this kind. So this, quote, Viking helmet has horns. That's problem number one. Vikings did not wear horns on their helmets. That's totally a Hollywood thing. I mean, if you think about it, if you have horns on your helmets, first of all, you're gonna have a problem going through doors and things like that. But also, if somebody hits you over the head with a sword, it'll hook on the horn, and there'll be all kinds of problems. So anyway, yeah, this is probably the farthest of the mark you'll see for outfits, historical outfits. But that's okay. I have something. Okay. Well, this is, even though this isn't really an authentic Viking outfit, we're going to be talking about Beowulf. Now, it's not really a Viking poem, but it is an outgrowth of the fusion between the Anglo-Saxon culture in 5th to 8th century England and the Vikings who were raiding England as well as the rest of the, Europe and even south into Africa and over into Canada through that time period as well. Okay. So, Viking, I mean, you'll see the Soldier of the Week that I put up, an idea of an Anglo-Saxon soldier. There is fur, by the way, this is not real fur, thank you, I would never do that. But anyway, yeah, there's fur, lots of chainmail. Chainmail is pretty expensive, so I don't got any. But a lot of chainmail, and you notice when you read Beowulf, there's so much talk about his splendid armor, his chainmail, and how strong it is, and his gleaming helmet and his gleaming sword, but really about that armor. That's a reflection of status, like it always has been. The better your armor, the kind of more of a stud that you are. First of all, you have more money, or you have supporters who can buy you cool stuff, but it also means you deserve the best. Often the bravest warriors, especially in like the northern European cultures, were given the best equipment because it was seen that, or it was felt that they'd earned it from the community they represented or belonged to. Okay, well, we're going to talk about Beowulf, we're going to talk about some characteristics of the poem, and we're also going to talk about the historical background. Now, the PowerPoint covers a lot of that. It talks about Anglo-Saxon culture and the Viking invasion and how those two cultures coexisted at the same time, and then how Christianity came and changed both of them. So you can look at that PowerPoint and learn a lot of that, but I'm going to be touching on some of those things while we talk about Beowulf. The translation you have, and I'm probably going to lose these, whatever these are, at any moment, but that's okay. The translation that you have in your book is by Seamus Heaney. He is a Nobel Prize winning Irish poet who died August the 30th, just not long before I'm making this outstanding video. And Seamus Heaney, I love his translation for a number of reasons, and one of my favorite things about it is the first word, so. I mean, that's how we tell stories. It's so great. It's just a touch that everybody. So I went to Walmart. You know, it goes on from there, and then of course you go to Walmart and you kill a dragon and a monster and things like that. But anyway, that's Heaney's translation, and his translation, though relatively recent, does work pretty hard to capture that Anglo-Saxon ethos, that Northern European ethos of the same repeated images throughout the poem: ice, steel, and of course lots and lots of blood, because it is a very gory poem. Not only do plenty of men die in horrible ways, but of course Grendel, poor Grendel, with the arm ripped off, and his mother, and then you guys didn't read the part about the dragon, but that gets pretty grody as well. Okay, well, now in the intro, like on the weekly unit on the website, I mentioned that I translated this poem in graduate school. Oh Lord, it was a beating. But I did learn a lot about the poem, and I emerged, as brutal as that class was, I emerged with my admiration for the poem intact. And my translation, terrible. Heaney's, good. And there goes that. So I'm going to lose this now. Okay, so Beowulf still has a fairly significant impact on our culture. Even if you'd never heard of or had read the poem before, if you think about it, I also mentioned in that intro this whole idea of fighting dragons and these big muscled warriors with lots of gold jewelry on them and armor. You know, this, I don't know, Beowulf didn't invent these things. By the way, we don't know who the poet is. The Beowulf poet is unknown, but we see it as an outgrowth of a culture. And that culture, that Anglo-Saxon culture and its mythical heroes have so much to do with what's now the fantasy genre. I mean, they're interlinked, they're inextricable. And so when you read Beowulf, you are indeed reading the precursor to, you know, Game of Thrones or Robert Jordan's books or any number of things like that. And in recent years, there was a movie made. Robert Zemeckis directed it. He's really into motion capture CGI movies. He did Polar Express, totally different kind of movie, of course, but he did that. And Beowulf, if you saw it, was all CGI, and he changed a lot of the elements of the plot to make it a little sexier and more relatable, I guess, to modern audiences. So Grendel's mother is basically naked Angelina Jolie, you know. So anyway, so you may have seen that movie, but Beowulf still exists in or still has an echo in our current culture. Okay, so we need to get some things clear. You remember in the Aeneid, we talked about how, okay, Romans wrote it, but it's set way before the Romans, you know, with the Trojan War and all this. Kind of similar here. The poem was written by Anglo-Saxons. Okay, again, we don't know exactly who, but it was an Anglo-Saxon poet or poets. And it's set in around 500 AD, which is shortly after England is invaded by these Germanic tribes. Angles, Saxons, Jutes. That's where we get the whole Anglo-Saxon name. And so, or where we apply that name. So, the poem is set around the 6th century AD, but the thing is that it was probably written 9th or 10th century AD, a few hundred years later. And what also adds kind of a wrinkle to it is that even though it's an English poem, okay, and what I mean by that is it's written in England. The language is Old English, which doesn't have much to do with the English I'm speaking now. Anyway, even though it's written in England, it's not set there. It's set across the North Sea in what is now Scandinavia. Geatland, which is what you may have read as Geatland in the poem. Geatland is what we would call southern Sweden today. And then Herot, which is the king's mead hall, his glorious mead hall, where a lot of the fighting and dying takes place. That is probably in Denmark. So if you Google the North Sea or you look up Denmark or something like that, you'll see Sweden, then there's a body of water, and then there's Denmark. And that's where the poem is set. Beowulf comes from what's now southern Sweden, goes across the water to Denmark to help King Hrothgar with this demon, Grendel, that's terrorizing him. Okay, so there are endless debates about this poem. I mean, granted, among English nerds, but there are endless debates. For instance, is it really English? Can you call it English even though it's based in Scandinavia? Also, is it something that was made up, you know, at the time the poem was written, or is it several hundred years old to begin with, and someone just happened to write it down? There's no way to know, but no matter what, we can absolutely connect this poem with the Anglo-Saxon culture, and that's what this whole lecture is all about, and some of the options you have to answer on the discussion boards. Okay, so very, very quick recap of the historical background. Again, like 500 AD, these Germanic tribes invade England, what is now England, and they take it over from the indigenous tribes. They speak what we now call Old English, which is much more closer to German than it is to the English we're speaking now. So that's what they speak, and that's what they write in. Now, they are pagan. That means that they do not worship the gods that we are familiar with today. Pagan cultures, I mean, the gods they worship are going to vary radically from region to region, but pagan means usually that you have gods that represent different natural phenomena. So you have a god of water, and you have a god of stone, and you have a god of the forest, and things like that. So these cultures speak Old English, and they are pagan. They come in again about 500 AD. They take over England, and it is not centralized. They set up these small regional kingdoms, and you know, you might have a king that rules over a certain area, and you have lords under him that report to him, and this kind of thing. But you don't have like a king of England or anything like that. There's no sense of it being England. Although that word England is taken from the tribe, the Angles. Anyway, so there's no centralized government, really. So in the about 300 years between when the Germanic tribes arrive in England and when the poem is written, a number of things happen. First of all, of course, the Anglo-Saxon culture takes root. The language develops a little bit, doesn't even get close to what we currently speak, but it changes somewhat. And then the big deal is Christianity arrives. And despite the values and the ethos of those tribal cultures, Christianity spreads pretty quickly. And you can see, and this is on the discussion boards as well, and it's one of the most enduringly fascinating things about the poem Beowulf, is you have a tension between pagan beliefs and tribal beliefs, and this whole heroism, and a man must commit these acts of heroic valor in order to be given gifts and to get women and this kind of thing, clashing with a value system based in Christianity. And that's what makes the poem so cool in a way, is because it has both. And you can tell, you know, the debate is it a Christian poem or isn't? Was it trying to, I mean, which is it really, if it has to be? Like, is it truly pagan? And then over the years, people put in Christian elements to pitch it to a different audience, or vice versa. We don't know, but it's awfully cool to talk about it. Interesting, anyway, to me. So, okay, well, so there's a 300-year period where the Anglo-Saxons are controlling England. Well, around the 9th, 10th centuries AD, here come the Vikings. The Vikings are not the same thing as the Anglo-Saxons. They're a different ethnic group. I mean, they're from the same region, kind of. Their language is similar, but not exactly the same. And they are what we call the Vikings. That's a catch-all term that encompasses a number of different peoples from that part of the world. But anyway, as you guys probably know from movies and so on, the Viking Age was full of raiding, plunder. The Vikings were not into centralized government. They weren't even really into settling. They just wanted to raid to gain glory and to see what was out there. And so what happens in England is that Viking raids come into the east of the island, and atypically the Vikings decide to settle. And so they settle in an area that's soon going to be called the Danelaw. Dane is in the Vikings. A lot of the Vikings come from what is now Denmark. So the Danelaw is an area that's under Danish law. That's like the Viking part. So for another couple hundred years, you're going to have this situation in England where you have Anglo-Saxon kingdoms and then you have Viking kingdoms. They are living next to each other, almost never peacefully. They're always fighting, and one side will get the edge over the other, or they'll form alliances. The alliances will fall apart. Lots of bloody warfare. Christianity has already hit the Anglo-Saxons, but before long it hits the Vikings too. And it is going to be, it spreads equally quickly. It causes a lot of civil wars in the Viking world because you'll have kingdoms where some people very firmly believe in the pagan ways, and of course Christian missionaries and recent converts are going to believe very passionately in their new belief, their adopted religion. So there's a lot of conflict. So England, around the time the poem is written, is just this big cauldron of religious tension. You could say ethnic tension between the Anglo-Saxons and the Vikings, even linguistic tension between Old English and Norse, which is what the Vikings speak. So it's kind of a jumbled world. And you know, for testing purposes, whatever, you don't need to know every last little facet of that, but you need to know the basics. Okay, now all that's going to be put to rest when William the Conqueror invades in 1066, and that may ring a distant bell from your history classes. He's from northern France, the Normans. They come in, they conquer England, they speak French, and the combination of their French with Old English is eventually going to lead to what I am speaking to you now and what you speak, modern English. All right, so that's kind of the historical background of all this. Let's talk for a minute about the poem itself, some of its characteristics, some of its trademarks. So I already mentioned, and this is on the discussion boards, and I want you guys to think about this. that tension between pagan beliefs and Christian beliefs that exist in the poem. There's so many places where it comes up, and there's so many places where it's almost kind of contradictory. I mean, on one hand, a hero is someone who performs great deeds in order to receive heroism and in order to receive gifts. You know, of course, Christianity has always, even though we can talk about televangelists and stuff like that, I mean, true Christianity, the core teachings of Christianity have always rejected materialism, okay? Yet in Beowulf, how do you know you're a stud? Because of your cool armor that your king gave you and all the gold you've got. Just all these gold rings and gold necklaces and all this stuff that you're given a gold hoard. And at the end of Beowulf, this is a part you didn't read, when Beowulf kills a dragon, the dragon is protecting this huge hoard of gold. So that's kind of antithetical to Christianity, and yet they're in there together. We're told over and over that God controls everything. The Lord is the Lord of all. Yet there's still parts of the poem where it's clear that people are acting as if they don't know the outcome of what's going to happen. So that tension between pagan and Christian beliefs, I think, is very fascinating. Okay. Also, another characteristic of the poem that is so enduring are the monsters. In fact, J.R.R. Tolkien, who you guys know from The Lord of the Rings, is the author of the books, the Lord of the Rings books. He wrote a very famous article, I want to say in the 1930s, called Beowulf, the Monsters and the Critics, in which he says, you know, nobody has paid any attention to these monsters when they write about this poem or talk about this poem. They view the monsters as kind of like, you know, you got to have a bad guy, so it's Grendel. But he says there's much more to that in the monsters, and I agree. I think Grendel, now, you know there is a biblical tie-in with Grendel. If you read the poem, you know that he's the poet, our unknown Beowulf poet tells us Grendel's associated with Cain. He's cursed. And so he's cut off from all contact, and he does not have any relationships, I guess, other than his mother. And his loneliness makes him very angry, and that's what makes him attack the humans in the Mead Hall. The Mead Hall, by the way, that's a phrase that means this great hall where all of your warriors get together and drink and talk smack and prepare for the next big project, you know, the next big battle or what have you. Well, anyway, Grendel, I think, and this is on the boards as well, Grendel is interesting because I think there's much more to him than just he's some cut-out monster. He's just a monster, you know. I think the poem makes clear there's more to him than that. His mother, too, is motivated by revenge. Revenge, of course, is a very common motivation for, an acceptable motivation for people in that Northern European culture around the time of the arrival of Christianity. Revenge is, and these vendettas and blood feuds and back and forth warfare between clans and neighboring kingdoms is very, very common. And Grendel's mother attacks the Mead Hall because she's frankly really pissed that her son was killed. And that right there, I think, is also unusual. It tells us that these monsters aren't just thoughtless, you know, the poet had to think of a bad guy, so let's make up some monsters. So anyway, I think in addition to that tension between Christian and pagan beliefs, the monsters are worth mentioning too, in terms of, and I'd like to see what you guys think about why are they in there, what are their beliefs, what do you think is noteworthy about them, if you do. Okay, a third characteristic of the poem that I think is interesting is foreshadowing. There's quite a bit of it in the poem, and that's kind of a sophisticated literary technique that you might not expect from a poem written about and by that particular culture. But throughout the poem, there are a number of statements that indicate that Beowulf, that dark days are ahead for him. Even though he's top dog, he's alpha male and all that, and he's all but invincible in battle, there are statements here and there that he too will die, he too will be disappointed. Yet again, I mentioned the pagan Christian bit because, you know, Christianity says all humans die, right? Now the idea is if you've done the right thing, you can sort of skip eternal damnation and oblivion. But in pagan beliefs, generally, unless you were a very brave warrior who was going to go on to their version of heaven, you were just done when you died. So there are statements kind of to both effects in Beowulf. And Beowulf himself, one line that I love is when when Beowulf shows up and says, "Hey, I'm here to kill your monster," and Hrothgar says, "Oh yes, I knew your father. And look at you, you're a big bad dude. I think this will be great. Shut up, Unferth," this kind of thing. And he says, "Take your place at the table." And there's two, I've always thought there were two meanings to that. One is, obviously you're a big bad guy. Why don't you sit here with the other big bad guys? You deserve it. That's pretty obvious. The other one is, take your place at the table. By the way, that's the same table where almost everyone who has sat there has been eaten in the middle of the night by this monster. So it's a welcome, but it's also kind of a challenge, and it's a bit of foreshadowing, I think. Even though Beowulf is not killed by Grendel, he is killed, he's fatally wounded at the end of the poem by the dragon. Now, he dies heroically and all this, but there's foreshadowing in the poem as well. Okay, fourth aspect of the poem I want to mention is kenning. Kenning is just figurative language. It's a figure of speech. That means that the Beowulf poet or poets came up with a number of phrases to stand in for other nouns, and some of them are pretty cool. Calling the sea the whale road or the swan's road. And you've also got, my favorite is probably when he talks about his body, as Beowulf's body, as a bone cage. And furthermore, Beowulf, when he and the Geats arrive on the shore of Hrothgar's kingdom, and that one sentry says, "Who are you? What are you doing here?" as if he's going to do anything about it. And Beowulf, in the poem, says the hero unlocked his word hoard. Like, he's going to talk now. So he's going to unleash his hoard of words. That's kind of interesting. But kenning is something else. That act of figurative language where the poet thinks of unusual words to stand in for other nouns. That he wants to draw attention to those nouns by replacing them, really. That's what kenning is. Okay. And the fifth thing that I want to mention, and then we'll close out this outstanding lecture. The fifth thing I want to mention is, again, how much attention is paid to material objects, and by that, objects of wealth. Armor, chainmail, helmets, axes, and then gold, tons of gold. Which, again, this is all kind of antithetical to Christian belief. I mean, in the Bible, usually, say David, or other biblical heroes, often at their moment of greatest triumph, they either won't be armed or they will not have armor on because God is behind them. You don't need any armor. Beowulf, God is behind him too. The poet tells us that numerous times, yet we still talk about all the armor. And that, again, for the millionth time, I think that's really cool, that tension, if you want to call it, between pagan and Christian beliefs. Okay. Oh, and also, after, one of my favorite scenes in the poem is, so, Grendel's dead, everything seems to be great, everybody's partying down, Welchau, which is the queen, Hrothgar's queen. She distributes necklaces, she gives this big old honking gold necklace to Beowulf, and everybody's happy. Well, that night, Grendel's mother comes knocking, and she's very upset. She grabs one of Hrothgar's favorite dudes and takes off with him, kills him. So Beowulf runs to the pond where she's jumped, and he's going to have to dive for who knows how long, miles, to get to her underwater lair. And on his way down, he has to kill a bunch of sea monsters and all this other stuff. But as he's about to jump into the pond, there's about, I don't have the poem in front of me, but 10, 15 lines describing all the armor he's buckling on. And I always think of modern action movies whenever, like an elite SEAL team or an elite group of bad guys is about to attack something. You spend 30 seconds or a full minute looking at magazines being put into the guns and all that stuff. I always think of that when I read that. It's like the Anglo-Saxon version of the weapons check scene in an action movie. We've got to talk about all of his armor and his chainmail and all this that he's strapping on. Okay, so what I'm going to close with is I want to mention a book And it's this book. It's John Gardner's Grendel. There it is. And John Gardner was a great, great novelist who died very young. And the book Grendel, now I realize none of you have spare time, but if you ever get any, and if Beowulf interested you at all, you ought to check out Grendel. Grendel is the story told from Grendel's point of view. And that may sound goofy, but it's really cool. It's one of my favorite books, and one moment that I love in it is, and you're not responsible for any of this, I'm just telling you, as a bonus for your hard-earned tuition money. Grendel is actually eavesdropping when Unferth and Beowulf are kind of talking smack to each other, and Beowulf, and Unferth says, "Oh well, I heard about your swimming contest, and I heard that was a bunch of BS, and that you chickened out." And Beowulf says, "No, actually, I swam 5 nights and I killed 9 sea monsters and all this other stuff." And Grendel is listening outside. He's the monster. He's the bad guy. He's cursed by God, and he's very upset. And he hears this and he says, "Oh, I see. He's completely insane." It's kind of funny because that old Norse idea of the hero, or Anglo-Saxon idea of the hero, this big, strong, muscular dude who's going to kill everything, a lot of it's heroism, but some of it might be insanity too, at least to later audiences, or to a monster. Okay, so I think that's probably all we need to do for now. I've inflicted enough upon you. But I hope that, this poem is deceptively simple. There aren't as many overt elements at work as maybe there were in the Aeneid or even in Gilgamesh, certainly in Lysistrata. But there is quite a bit there. And I think it's because you have different cultures coming together, different religious and tribal and ethnic pressures coming together. So anyway, I hope you were able to enjoy the poem to some degree. And thanks much for your time, and I will talk to you soon.